In this talk, we're going to focus on incident reviews and we used to call them postmortems, and in particular, focusing not on how we would gather the information, but how we present a narrative and present a story in a written artifact that people actually want to read. So, brief slide about me. I went for the traditional bio this time, some books, things like that. I worked for Slack for 3 years quite recently, and I'm known for some long-form incident reviews that we published as engineering blog posts. Some stuff. I'm on the USENIX board, etc., etc. Now, if anyone wants to go and drink more coffee, here is basically the TLDR of the talk. I think that engaging incident reports are valuable for a whole host of reasons that I'll go into next. And I think that one of the things that we do wrong is that we treat our incident reviews, particularly the write-ups, as a big form to fill in. Who here in this room likes forms? One person, oh, 3 people, okay. You guys are a very small minority. People do not like forms. Forms are terrible. We need to focus on treating these things as stories, as narratives, as artifacts that engage each other, rather than as a giant form to fill in. We also need to do a better job at supporting our readers to understand the things that we are talking about in our incident reports. Being visual is one way we can do that. And we need to not be so scared of putting in some analysis when we write up incident reports. We've learned some things, we've built some mental models, and we should share those. And finally, style is important because it makes it more pleasant to read people's work. And if we want to share things that we have learned, it makes sense to make these things pleasant to read. People are not going to read things that they think are boring, that are just difficult to get through. So make it easy, make it fun. We should have joy at work, and I think many of us really enjoy incident stories, postmortems, incident analyses. I mean, there was a great talk this morning on the meta outage. These stories are a major way that we learn, that we improve as an industry, and I think it's important. And I think we need to do a better job at sharing that information. So specifically, written incident reports, and I do think that meetings and discussions about incidents are a very important thing to do, and I think that the whole process of going out and interviewing people who are involved in incidents and gathering all that information is important. But I think that the outcome of a written artifact, specifically a written artifact, is really important because that's something that can hang around in your organization and potentially outside your organization if you release some version of it publicly. And that's a really valuable long-term source of learning. It helps your organization sort of keep that memory if it's something that people are going to periodically go back to and read. There's a whole debate around internal and external postmortems and incident reports, and they're not the same thing. I'm not going to argue that they're the same thing, but there is a sort of a power in releasing something publicly, because I find that if you release a write-up publicly, that public attention that it gets sort of reinforces the internal lessons as well. So specifically, there is a benefit in writing and writing about these things publicly. The written format encourages thoughtful reflection in a way that's relatively hard to do in a synchronous meeting, just because people don't have the time to develop and to sort of articulate their thoughts in the same way. Writing is thinking, and people have been saying that for millennia. I think it's still true. So specifically, written artifacts are an important output of our kind of postmortem of our incident review process. And this then goes on to onboarding. It helps keep those organizational memories of the ways that our systems work alive. And I think we can see this across the entire industry. Anyone who isn't familiar with the Void community, the Verica Open Incident Database, it's a very cool resource. It's very nice if you're using particular open source software, jump on there, search for the tools that you're using. Almost certainly you're going to find something that you didn't know. So I think it's particularly valuable for those sorts of sharp edges that we get on open source projects and on SaaS projects. And if we're developing platforms and projects, it's also very useful to sort of understand the sharp edges in these kinds of systems so that we can maybe avoid making the same mistakes again. Particularly with respect to public incident reports as well, your customers will enjoy transparency. If you approach them honestly and humbly as a sort of an engineer-to-engineer conversation, that resonates really well. And in almost all cases I've seen, people respond really well to it and think better of your company, right? This is another reason why written incident reports are, I think, important. All the systems that we work on are constantly changing, and in order to operate these systems well, as Richard Cook, who we unfortunately lost this year, or IP, as he points out, we need a lot of human expertise when we operate these systems. And the only way that we develop and maintain that human expertise is by conscious practice. And that's why, one of the reasons why incident reviews are such an important part of our practice. This is the way that we learn, the way we keep these mental models updated. Therefore, we need to write. We need to think and we need to write. And we need to keep that expertise alive. Too many organizations focus more on the process of incident reviews than on the learning that we get out of them. You know, we say, okay, we need to have this review done within the first 3 days after an incident, and we need to come up with action items, and we need to make it look like we're really busy. And sometimes we can do all that, but we're not actually learning. So again, this is the sort of the ritual around the learning, but not the learning itself. And this is why I think that we're so trapped sometimes in this formulaic, sort of template-driven approach to incident reviews. And this is why we can end up in this sort of shallow place where we're writing reviews and we're getting nowhere. I remember one time, this was, I won't name the organization, I was doing some work as an incident commander and I got pulled into an incident in a part of the system that I didn't know particularly well. And I went to the incident review meeting afterwards, and it turned out that the part of this incident, a component of this incident, was a thing that had been repeatedly happening, time after time again. So this was a sort of a mitigation operation that we could do, but sometimes it backfired. And the reason it was backfiring was there were 2 different rate limits, and one rate limit basically said, if there's quota here, please update your client and do a new boot. The other rate limit was, do I actually have quota to do this expensive boot operation? All of these reviews related to this particular pain point, and no one had said, why are we not aligning these 2 rate limits so we don't ask people to update if there isn't quota for them to boot? Because people are just sitting there going through that process shallowly and not actually thinking about what they can learn from it. So here is a bunch of metadata. This is what the we're back to ripping up the Google SRE book here just for a moment. This is the incident template, or at least the first third of it, which the SRE book advises you should use. And here's some more of it. And here's some more of it. And wow, okay. Cookie cutters are for cookies and not for learning. This is, anyone confronted with this is going to go, oh my God, I have all of this stuff I have to fill in, and they're just going to race through this as quickly as possible. Because it's a form and you want to be done with it, right? We're all trained to do that. There's no space in a form like this for learning, for reflection, for analysis. I think these big, lengthy, complex templates directly work against it. So what I always advise when, and sure, maybe you want to track some of this metadata. It's not wrong to track the author or the status of the document or the impact time, or any of that stuff. I do kind of have some questions with things like what went well and what went wrong and where we get lucky, because I think that they tend to provoke very shallow answers. You know, okay, oh, we got lucky that, you know, somebody noticed X thing. There's not a lot of value to that unless you're thinking more about the deeper meaning of this. Okay, so somebody noticed this thing X. You know, why was it likely or unlikely that they would notice that? How can we make it more easy for the next person to reason about the system? Instead, we just tend to get, okay, well, somebody noticed the thing, and no further, deeper thought. So what should we do instead? Okay, I should apologize here because this whole talk is full of sort of 80s and 90s media references. And it's not because I'm old, because, well, I am, but it's not because of that reason. It's because we got Netflix, and then basically we have this long tail of content, and nobody has, you know, coherent, shared sort of media references anymore. So that's why all the media references are old. But does anyone recognize this? Okay. Wow, less people than I thought. Okay. This is an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. And the episode's called Darmok. And the shtick here was that Captain Picard is trapped on the planet with this alien. But the alien has a really weird way of communicating. The alien says things like, Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra. And what he means is he's referencing a story in his culture of these people, Darmok and Jalad, and they collaborated together to solve a problem even though they're enemies, right? So he's referencing this story, and this story to him brings a whole host of context and information. Now, if I say on this stage, Postgres transaction ID wraparound, does that story have any context to anyone? Does that bring meaning? Yeah, it does. Stories are important. Stories are really, really powerful. They're a very, very human way of transmitting information in a memorable fashion. And incidents, every incident is a story. And we need to harness the power of those stories. I mean, every incident has a cast of characters. They kind of have a little detective story. They have a little disaster story element. Sometimes they're a tragedy. Sometimes they're a comedy. Make the most of that when you write about them, because it will make reading them a lot more engaging. Now, here is an example of how not to do it, and I was inspired by the plenary talk from later today, Emily's talk that she's going to do on Jurassic Park and incident reviews. But here is how to make your incident a blockbusting Michael Crichton movie by Steven Spielberg into the most boring thing possible. Yeah, and this is what way too many of our incident reviews look like. You know, some deaths resulted. Okay. There's no learning here, right? And there's no sort of enjoyment here either. So here are some examples of things that I think are good. And unfortunately, it was only after I proposed this talk that I realized the only way to actually show writing examples is sort of an anti-pattern of too many slides or too much text on a slide. But nevertheless, this is an incident. I will share all these slides later so that the links will be available. But the TLDR here was that Firefox got broken. It was an event loop kind of problem. But the write-up is really, really nice. And it's really nice because he kind of talks through it as like a detective story. What were they thinking at the time? What did they know? How did they sort of unravel it? And it's quite an engaging piece of writing. And it's a piece of writing that could have been much drier, and I think with much less engagement and learning for the industry, right? This one by GitLab, by Devin Silva, is another one of my favorite ones. So they had a pretty horrible incident, and I remember I was running a lot of console when I read this, so it had a particular resonance. But it's a great piece of writing. So they decided, they found out that all of their certs had expired, and they had no way of rolling them over because they had lost their CA key. So it's a great story, and I recommend that everyone should read this. But These sorts of statements, I mean, they sort of really set the stage. They kind of show the drama. You know, they're in the middle of an incident. They just don't have any impact yet. It's peril. You know, this is a story of peril and drama. They're holding their breath. They're watching for signs of distress. You know, it's great. You know, it really puts them in the mindset, okay? And yes, it leads to a longer piece of writing. It takes a longer time to read this than it does to read the sort of Jurassic Park style, you know, form-filling review. But you're going to remember this, you know. I read this, and a couple of years later, I said I was looking for examples to put in this talk, and I remembered this story, you know. And that's effective. It lodged in my brain. Now, the other thing that we frequently do a poor job of is we don't support our readers very well. And what I mean here is we should be able to write our incident reviews such that any engineer can read them. Not even any engineer who's worked with similar types of systems. Any engineer at all. The new person on your team, your intern, should be able to get something from it. So, concretely, explain jargon and system names, particularly if they're internal systems. What do these systems do? What's their purpose? You know, what's their sort of rough semantics? Explaining why things are how they are is always an interesting thing to do, particularly if it's not obvious. Like, you know, in the previous, say, Meta talk, they talked about having a safety checker system. You know, why was that safety checker system written? You know, what was that designed to solve for them? There's two ways of sort of giving the reader support. You can weave either quite lengthy or sometimes quite concise explanations into the text. And linking out to more detailed documentation is almost always a great thing to do. So put in like a 1 or 2 sentence explanation of what it is you're trying to explain and link out to the longer version. But I mean, this is what takes us from a postmortem that's sort of unreadable and frankly useless jargon word salad to something that's actually meaningful to most engineers. So, transaction ID wraparound, like we said. This is a really nice write-up that supports the reader. It's a little bit old, but it's pretty great because it actually gives got a very concise but readable and good explanation, and it links out to longer piece of documentation. This is a really, really great example of supporting the reader. Then here's another one, Go Cardless. They have this postmortem here where they're talking about their vault, and they have this little paragraph here where they explain the context of why they have this system. You know, it's short, but it really sort of kind of gets to the point of what is this, why does it exist? And it's very easy when you're working with these systems and you go, well, obviously this is why we have Vault. But somebody else on a different team with a different focus is not going to know that. Putting in a few paragraphs like this makes this accessible beyond your team. And this is how we share information and context in a broader organization and beyond. Being visual is incredibly powerful. Picture is worth 1,000 words, possibly more, but also they reinforce the text. They help people to understand what you're talking about by giving the same information in a slightly different way. They're more likely to remember it, they're more likely to understand it. Then they also they break up a long document and make it a little bit, human brains, we're all fallible, we all have problems with maintaining attention and getting through a long document. At least I do. And, having an occasional sort of break to look at something visual actually does help that. So here is the place where you can unleash your creativity. We have amazing tools now, Lucid Charts, Excalidraw, all of these things, be creative. So architecture diagrams are good, but also things like graphs, sequence diagrams, timelines, causal loop diagrams that I talked about in yesterday's plenary. Do what you will here. Cloudflare do a lot of nice write-ups, in particular when they do their graphics. Somebody here does a really nice job. Here's a much simpler little visual. This is this is just some text and some tables, But they're talking about a fairly subtle sharding problem here. And they do a really nice job here of sort of illustrating the before and the after, how they changed how this load was spread in their system. So you don't need to be a graphic designer to do this. You just need to be a little bit creative. Here's one by my colleague Rafa. Rafa, are you in the room? Rafa's giving a talk about this DNSSEC rollout outage later in the conference, and he and I worked together on the Slack's public write-up, and I said, Rafa, we need diagrams, and he came back with this. I thought he did a lovely job describing the sort of the sequence of rollouts that were part of this, very long kind of sequence of events that happened. Analysis. A lot of us just shy away from any sort of analysis or sort of, we're scared to sort of say what we've learned and give our opinions, I think, about the outages that we write about. And what that means is, as a narrative, as a sort of a story, we can be left without a feeling of resolution, right? I know this seems a bit waffly, but, I think it's very unsatisfying to just read this, sort of sequence of events of X happened, then Y happened, then Z happened. As human beings, we want to sort of see the patterns, the systemic effects, and that's very much, I think, what we're about as a profession. So I think we may as well just put these into our write-ups. We learned something. Try and actually share what you learned, and it makes the narrative just more satisfying. It's like we have a moral of the story now. So this is from that same console certificate problem that I mentioned earlier. So this Devin here does a great job of sort of just wrapping up with his thoughts about the incident, like what he learned. So, and he kind of comes, he goes back to sort of great sysadmin practices, understanding how everything works and being able to sort of make these kinds of decisions on the fly. And this, it gives a really nice sort of feeling of resolution to this really excellent write-up. And here's Honeycomb again, the 24 of September. They're sort of coming up with their learnings here, and they've got a sort of a socio-technical lens here as well. They operated too far from the edge, they lost sight of it, and can't anticipate when corrective work should be done. It burns out the team, they get tired, they're unable to do this sort of proactive reliability work. So they're talking about this need to sort of create balance for the time to do that. And again, this is a great resolution to a great write-up. It gives that feeling of sort of closure, right? So the last aspect is craft. We're creating something that we want other people to read and to enjoy, hopefully. There's actually no rule against enjoying our work. So there's a few little sort of just writing crafts here, things here, like titles like The Outage That Happened on the 4th of January is probably not a great title, right? Try and describe what happened in a title that people remember. There is nothing more annoying than saying, oh man, I read this great thing 6 months ago and now I can't find it. The title is the index into your brain, so try and pick good descriptive titles that people will remember, they'll be able to find again. So this is a reasonably good example of this, that people have described, what happened in a way that, you can probably find this again later. Another kind of craft aspect is using simple and clear language. Again, try and avoid the jargon, avoid sentences that are excessively complex. This is a nice sort of, again, the same console write-up. And this is a nice, simple sort of explanation of how this process works. Language, very simple, very clear. There's very sort of clear chain of events that go through here. And, talking about what should happen. This is easy to read. So avoid big, long, complex sentences, many, many clauses. This is basic sort of technical writing 101, but it applies here too. So don't try to appear smart by using lots of complicated sentences and big words. The way to truly appear smart is to write things that people will read all the way to the end. And then being too formal or informal. Most of this sort of writing, this is not academic writing, you're not writing a paper. So, you can chill a little bit. You probably don't want to be too informal either. Depending on the incident and its severity, it might be appropriate to use a little bit of humor, but sometimes it's not. If it's something that really harmed your customers, you need to have that sort of solemn tone. But sometimes we have incidents where things happen that are just frankly a bit funny, and if nobody was harmed, then it's okay to talk about that. Walls of text. Walls of text are very, very bad. I talked about this in the visuals section. Visuals are great for breaking up a long piece of writing. So are headers. So, think about sections in your work, the structure of it. Try and put in headings that reflect that. And again, it makes it easier if somebody wants to refer back to just a piece of your writing later on. They'll be able to find it using the heading. So again, this is a sort of a human indexing technique. And sentence rhythm, use short sentences and then have a longer flowing sentence. A bunch of short staccato sentences in a row is very difficult and unpleasant to read. And again, lots of long, complex sentences are very unpleasant to read as well. So just, read over what you write and make sure it reads nicely. Use a consistent tense. Most of the time we're writing about things that have happened in the past, so use the past tense. Maybe you'll have reasons to vary from that, but it's quite jarring if the tenses sort of get random in a document. Confusing and obscure cultural references and metaphors. So again, we're back to the 90s media here and Demolition Man. Nobody knows how to use the 3 shells, and that's intentional in the movie. Don't intentionally confuse your readers. So that goes for the jargon and also for cultural references. So, as an Irish person, I wouldn't say, well, I sent your man Joe off to restart the service, because nobody will understand what I mean by that. So try and, write in international English. Now, very last thing, if you're writing something that is going to be released publicly, don't make it a sales pitch. Just be humble, honest, and write for your fellow engineers. Nothing is more jarring than reading something that says things like, well, we used our own product and we resolved this incident super well. Because people will just get annoyed by that. So I would avoid that. So that's really the whole talk. So to recap, written incident reports are how we collectively learn and maintain information over time, inside our organization and maybe outside. Stories are a really effective way to communicate information, human being to human being. We're not computers. We don't need forms and metadata. Try and write reports that don't assume specialized knowledge, jargon. So support your reader with concise explanations and links out to better or more full documentation as needed. Be visual, be creative about how you convey your information. Text is only one mechanism, and we have a lot of others at our disposal. Share your analysis, share your takeaways. Pay attention to style, headers, titles, that kind of thing. And don't write a sales pitch. That's it, really.